Tonight, we begin our four-part series, The Promise and Peril of Citizenship, Jewish Paths to Belonging, with Dr. Geraldine Gudefin. What did it mean for Jews to become citizens, and what did the new status require? From revolutionary France to modern Israel, this series explores how Jews navigated evolving ideas of rights, identity, and belonging in a changing world. In this opening session, we turn to Western Europe and the uneven path of emancipation. Why were some Jews embraced as citizens while others remained suspect? By comparing Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities, we uncover a story of citizenship that was never simple, but always contested and far-reaching. We extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Spring 2026 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one, or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Geraldine Gudefin is a French-born modern Jewish historian specializing in Jewish migration, family life, and legal pluralism. She holds a master's degree from Yale University and a PhD in history from Brandeis University. Her work has been published in American Jewish History and Nashim, a journal of Jewish women's studies and gender issues. She has received fellowships from the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Posen Foundation, and the Center for Jewish History. Dr. Gudefin's earlier research examined Jewish marriage and family law in France and in the United States. Now based in Southeast Asia, she is currently researching Jewish life in colonial Singapore. And with that, I now welcome Dr. Gudefin to join us.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the kind introduction. First of all, let's check on the sound. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Okay, please signal. Sometimes there are connection issues. It's actually Tuesday here, so hello from the future. I'm based in Singapore, so it's 8 a.m. here on Tuesday. So sometimes the connection fails me a bit. So please let me know right away so that I don't carried away having lost, the whole group. So thank you so much to the Haberman Institute for having me back. I taught a few months ago now a history of Jewish communities in Asia, and it was such a delight to interact with the community. So I really appreciate the invitation. The first thing, perhaps, is I would be very curious to know where people are connecting from or calling in from. So if it's easy for you to write where you're based, city or country in the chat, that would be great. I would look at it later. So thank you very much for doing this. So perhaps I'll start with the kind of genealogy of this class. How did I get interested in this topic, and what the materials that we're going to be examining, how did it emerge? So because of my interest in American and European history, because of my interactions with Jewish communities all over the world, I've always been exceedingly interested in the question of rights, Jewish rights. And how did we come to inhabit the world that we live in? I think despite threats on communities, and those threats are taking comes in all shapes, we live in an era of unprecedented rights. So how did we get to that moment? That's something that I was always interested in, and I taught in my classes. And then last year, I had the opportunity to write an online curriculum, a teaching module for the Posen Library. And I want to say this here because it's an incredible resources, and there are a lot of people online I think who might be interested. So the Posen Library, for many years now, created volumes of primary sources so be it written sources or paintings, anything that Jews have produced that shed light on Jewish voices in the past. And those used to be physical volumes. But lately, the Posen Library has realized that a lot of people don't go to libraries anymore, don't use books, so there needs to be a digital medium for people to access these voices. So they put, I think it's many thousands of primary sources online, which are free to access for anyone. You need to create an account, but it's free and it's an incredible resource. If some of you are teachers, this is something you might be interested in because you can type India and you'll find sources for and by Jews in India in the past, right? So incredible resource. So as part of this digital turn, the Posen Library hired 8 scholars last year to create digital modules. And 2 of us were working on Jews and citizenship in the modern era. So we're going to be talking about the modern era in this module because it's based on what I created for the Posen Library. So my colleague, Lila Cohen-Berman, was tasked with looking at citizenship in the United States. And I was tasked with doing the rest of the world, Jews and citizenship in global perspective, which, as you might imagine, was quite a daunting task because where do you even start? There have been Jews in many corners of the world. So pretty much for a year, I've been grappling with this. How do we tell this history? What sources do we look at? And it was, daunting, but also exhilarating because it forced me to really think about citizenship, rights, belonging in a really broad way, comparatively, transnationally, etc. So that's what I want to attempt to do here with you online. So a lot of what I'm bringing today and in the next few sessions is based on those primary sources that I've identified. But because of the constraints of the class, where it's 4 1-hour online sessions, we can't go into so many details into the primary sources themselves. So I really invite you, if you're interested in seeing a bit more of the primary sources, to go on the Posen Library website and look at the module that I created. And the other caveat I would say is because I worked on everything but the United States, I am not going to talk about the United States during those 4 classes. But I really invite you to look at Lila's module on that topic. And also, I would like to point your attention to the fact that Lila, I think her book is coming out soon. I forget the title of her book, but I think it's called What is an American? So she just finished, is about to publish a book that really deals with the question of citizenship and belonging in the US context. So I think that would be a great resource if you're interested in this. And then the other kind of bibliographical note is that I believe that the Haberman Institute hosted my colleague Britt Tevis, maybe in the fall, to talk about anti-Semitism. So Britt just published an anthology of primary sources. It's like a reader on American anti-Semitism. And of course, it dovetails, it deals with questions of citizenships and rights as well. So for the US aspect of the story, I think those would be 2 really great resources. So just a note about what's coming next, because I know that people could have the option to register individually for each class. So it's great if you're only joining us today. That's fabulous. But if you're interested, I'll give you a short outline of the topic we're going to cover in the next sessions. So in the second session, we'll look at the Russian and Ottoman empires in comparative perspective and what it meant to be Jewish as these 2 big empires were about to collapse. In the third session, we're going to talk about colonialism. And actually, we will return to the topic of France then. And then we will talk about Israel. What does it mean to be Jewish in an era where Jews have a state, right? Which is, really a rupture with the previous sessions we will be focusing on. And the goal of those 4 sessions is really to examine the multiple paths to Jewish citizenship that have characterized the previous decades. I'm really glad to see so many people join today because I know, speaking for myself, that I felt a great sense of urgency in studying this history and in teaching this history, especially after October 7th. I think it would be fair to say that a lot of people in the Jewish community, including myself, have been very unsettled by developments all over the world. A lot of assumptions that we lived with have been shattered. The idea that Israel was a safe haven, a place that's safe for the Jews. I think the physical threats that people have experienced since have maybe changed this notion for many of us. The idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that there was no anti-Semitism in the US, I think has also been shattered. Then the resurgence of anti-Semitism on both the left side of the aisle and the right side. Like, I think the geopolitical context and domestic context of places in which Jewish communities lived have created a lot of uncertainty about the future. And I think for this reason, looking at rights and citizenship in Jewish history is particularly important. So my three goals for these four sessions are: one, to understand the history of Jewish rights within the longue durée, across many centuries, because we really cannot understand the moment we're in unless we take kind of a broad view of history and we situate ourselves within that history. Second, one thing that I think is really striking when you look at the history of Jews and citizenship is that Jews have always been divided about where they belong, about what the future ought to look like, and also how to fight for their own rights. And we're in a moment of Jewish divisions over Israel, over all kinds of things. And understanding that this is not new, I think is really helpful and soothing in some ways. And third, my last goal for this class is to really give you a glimpse into Jewish lives in the past and into voices. And that's why primary sources really do matter. Because when you hear voices from Jewish individuals in the past, you really can see how they stood up for themselves and how they articulated and fought for their rights. And I think it's very inspiring. And so this is really what I'm hoping to do today and over the next month. Any questions so far before I start my PowerPoint? No. Okay, so I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Let me know if there are any technical issues. From beginning. Sorry, it always takes a little bit of time to set up. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is the concept of legal emancipation across Europe. So we're looking specifically at Europe today. And perhaps one word about emancipation, because this is not a word that all of you are necessarily familiar with. So when historians, especially modern Jewish historians, talk about emancipation, they refer to the process through which Jews acquired civil and political rights. And this is really important. So civil rights refer to freedom of occupation, freedom of movement, freedom of worship, among other rights. And political freedom refers to full participation in the political system. Okay, so as you can see on the map here, this process in Europe was extremely uneven. People, Jewish communities across Europe, acquired rights, full rights of citizenship at different times. So I'm not going to look at every country, but here, for example, you can see that Belgium was 1830, Germany, so with the unification of Germany, it was 1871. Russia, it was with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So here you can really see kind of a delay in when communities actually acquired those rights. What I want to say at the outset is the map is misleading, and that's what I want to show you in this class today. Why? Because when you see a country and a date under, there's this sense that the acquisition of rights was something that occurred abruptly on this given date. And what I want to show is a much more complex picture of how Jewish individuals acquired rights. The only reason why the map can be misleading is that because it's based on nations, it doesn't allow for the fact that this is really a transnational story. And this is a transnational story for three reasons, I would say. The first one is rulers who made the decision to emancipate Jews were influenced by what authorities in other parts of Europe were doing, right? So they were inspired by reforms happening in other places. They read philosophers in other countries, right? So they didn't make those rules completely in isolation from political developments in other places. That's the first reason. The second reason is that Jews themselves were looking at what was happening in other places, and they advocated for their rights based on what they saw happening in these other places, right? So in that sense, it's also a transnational story. And the third reason is Jewish mobility, that Jews across Europe migrated over the centuries, and that's definitely true in the modern era. And so the story of Jewish mobility and Jewish migration is also central to the story of how Jews acquired rights in the modern era. So next, I want to turn to a quote from this book by David Sorkin. I don't know if you ever invited him to Aberman. He's a fabulous modern Jewish historian who's worked a lot on German Jewry, European Jewry. And in 2020, he published this really path-breaking book called Jewish Emancipation. And when I read it, I was very unsettled by it. It felt ominous in some ways. It just gave me a lot of food for thought. And revisiting the book, especially the introduction in the post October 7th era, has been really illuminating for me. And so as a way to kind of pause the question of what is citizenship and what does it mean for Jews in the modern era, I really wanted to start with David Sorkin's book. Okay, and remember that this was written in 2020. So you write in the introduction to the book, equality and the exercise of citizenship were and are always and everywhere fragile, subject to substantial infringement, if not outright abrogation. And the next sentence is what really stuck with me. The process of emancipation continues into the 21st century. Jews everywhere live in the era of emancipation. Some readers may find this book's conclusions disturbing. Once we realize that emancipation is an interminable process that is an integral aspect of Jews' contemporary experience, we are forced to acknowledge that there are, in fact, no settled answers to the most pressing political and indeed existential issues of Jewish life. Neither the establishment of Israel nor the flourishing of American Jewry, let alone the rebuilding of Jewish life in Europe, has definitely answered emancipation's challenges. The larger struggle for political equality and the full exercise of citizenship for Jews, by Jews, and for other groups remains pressing. The only thing we can confidently assert is that this struggle is inherently protean. It will be populated by ever new issues and causes, by proponents and opponents whose appearance and actions we cannot predict. So you can see how eerie it is to reread this only 6 years later, but the context has changed so much. And I think the questions of Jewish rights has also evolved in quite radical ways. And so my goal really for this class is to kind of help you situate yourself within that broader history, right? That this is not just history. What I'm going to talk about today happened several centuries ago, right? It seems like it's far away in time, but in many ways it isn't. Okay, so if this is the lone insight you get from this course, that's already a success as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so today one thing I'm particularly interested in is how the trajectories of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in Europe diverge, but in some ways also overlapped. And this brings question about the role of economic life in the questions of rights and the ways in which even in one given place, either city or countries, rights could look so differently for Jews, right? So I really want you to move away from a notion that there was such a thing as a unified Jewish community where everyone benefited from the same rights. And if you look at the history of Europe, even before the modern era, the legal status of Jews was extremely varied. It depended, according to cities, nations, empires, and even in one single location, Jewish rights look differently depending on what community we looked at. And this is very visible when we look at Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. This is, I think, a community that's familiar with those terms, but just to make sure everyone is on the same page, Ashkenazi Jews refer to Jews from the Rhineland region. So the border of France and Germany, and then across centuries, Jews migrated eastward from the Rhineland region to what is Eastern Europe, right? So this is Ashkenazi Jews. Sephardic Jews refers to Iberian Jews, Jews from Spain and Portugal. In 1492 and a few years later in Portugal, Spanish and Portuguese Jews were persecuted by the Inquisition and were either forcibly converted, so they were able to remain in Iberia if they adopted outwardly Christian identities, or they were expelled. And so this events in the 1490s created a pretty widespread Western Sephardic diaspora that stretched from Iberia to other parts of Europe to the Spanish Portuguese colonies in Latin America, among other places. And this is really central to understanding the story we're going to discuss today. Okay, so let's get started. So the way I want to do this today is by looking at three lives and the ways in which their story is intersected in some ways. Okay, so those are the three people we're going to look at, and I thought it might be useful for you to visualize the map so that you can see exactly what we're talking about. So we're going to start with Lopez Suazo. Antonio Lopez Suazo was this gentleman on the top left, right next to Amsterdam. So Lopez Suazo was based in Amsterdam starting at the age of 40, but he actually spent the first part of his life further down on the map in the French city of Bordeaux. So on the southwestern side of what is France today, which was a port city. Amsterdam, of course, was also a port city. The second person we'll talk about is Glico of Hamel. So Suazo, as the name indicates, was a Sephardic Jew of Portuguese descent. Next to him, you see Glico from Hamel, who was an Ashkenazi Jew born near Hamburg. And we're going to look at her description of her childhood in Hamburg. And then going into the revolutionary moment in France, we're going to look at a man named Serf Burr, who was a merchant who was very involved in the process of Jewish emancipation in France. So you see here kind of the geographical scope of the talk. Okay, so let's start with Antonio Lopez Suazo. So Lopez Suazo was born in 1714 in Bordeaux, in southern France. And he actually was born into a family who was nominally, and not so nominally actually, Christian. His family came from Portugal, where they had been forcibly converted to Catholicism in the late 15th century. And his parents moved to Bordeaux, which is a city that started admitting new Christians or converts, new Christians. So this former Jews who had converted to Christianity in Iberia. And they accepted them into the city as Christians, right? Not as Jews. And his family was exceedingly educated. He came from a family of doctors, university professors, and he himself received quite a prestigious education. Interestingly, his brother was a Catholic clergyman. And his parents had actually hoped that Antonio himself would go on to become a priest, which is not the path that he followed, as you will see shortly. So let's zoom in for a moment on the status of Bordeaux's new Christians in the 16th century and beyond. So in 1550, so prior to the birth of Antonio Suazo, the French king issued lettre patente, which was a formal document that granted rights to this community of Portuguese merchants. And the rights that they were given were on par with those of Christian merchants. They had freedom of movement. They acquired freedom of commerce, which was very significant both for Jews themselves and for the city, because the city became in part, flourishing economically thanks to those families. They gained the rights to owning property and the rights to write wills, right? So quite extensive civil rights. And that allowed those new Christian families to play a really pivotal role in the city's finances. So what's really interesting about Bordeaux is that later, so this actually occurred after Antonio Lopez Suazo's passing in 1720, the King of France officially recognized this community of Portuguese merchants as Jews. Because what happened in the decades that followed their immigration to Bordeaux is that many, not all, but many of these individuals and families actually returned to Jewish practice. And this is something that became, publicly known. And that is what allowed the king in the 18th century to recognize them as Jews. But while he recognized them as Jews, he didn't take away their previous privileges. So what that means is that you have a Jewish community prior to the legal process of an emancipation that benefited from rights that were more or less equal to that of Christian merchants, right? So almost on like legal standing with the Christian community in Bordeaux. So to go back to Soissons, when he was 40, he moved to Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic. And in Amsterdam, he openly returned to Judaism. And so what that meant is that he underwent circumcision because he hadn't been circumcised as a child. He adopted a Jewish name, the name of Isaac Israel Soissons, and he was known, that's the name that he went by within the Jewish community, right? So he became a figure that was very openly Jewish in Amsterdam. So the situation in Amsterdam was reminiscent of the situation in Bordeaux, but different in that in Amsterdam, there were no charters or specific laws about Jews. So there was no law that recognized Jews as a collective. And so that allowed for Jews to actually gain greater rights than in a lot of places in Europe. So starting in the 1590s, a lot of Sephardic merchants from Spain and Portugal began to settle in the Dutch Republic and specifically in Bordeaux. And this is one of the reasons why Lopez Suazo settled there in 1644, because there was already an established community of conversos and people who had openly returned to Jewish practice. And there, the Jewish community, the Sephardic community specifically, enjoyed also a great array of rights. Freedom of residence, property rights, they could worship openly, they could freely engage in commerce, etc. And in fact, only a few years after Lopez Suazo moved into the city, the Sephardic Jews were formally recognized as full subjects of the Netherlands, right? So you see here an image of Jews that really differs from this idea that we think of Jews prior to emancipation as living in a ghetto, being poor, being uneducated. This is a very different story, right? And I think what really encapsulates this for me is the pictures that you see here on the slide. So on the left side, you have a painting of Antonio Lopez Suazo, which shows that he was part of the mercantile elite. I think people would not have been able to guess that he was Jewish in any way, shape, or form. And perhaps even more notably, the bust on the right side, this sculpture, this marble sculpture that was crafted by one of the most important Dutch sculptors at the time, right? That shows you that this was a man of great standing. So what gave him this standing? So Lopez Suazo became one of the wealthiest and most prominent Portuguese Jewish merchants in Amsterdam because he was involved in international trade. And this was a characteristic feature of the Western Sephardic diaspora, that because of this international migration, because they were multilingual, because they were involved in commerce, even before the Inquisition, they had commercial skills that were of great value to European cities and rulers. And this is really the reason why they gained those rights, is that in the age of mercantilism, cities like Bordeaux and Amsterdam were very interested in having people who would help enrich the city. So Antonio Lopez Suazo started importing and trading all kinds of goods, including Spanish wool. Again, here you can see the Iberian connection, how they drew on their Iberian identity and connections to engage in this global trade. So he imported Spanish wool that was used to make textiles. And of course, this is a time when textile played a huge role in the Dutch Republic. He also imported gemstones from India, among other goods. And then, perhaps even more significantly, in 1674, so after 20 years in Amsterdam, he started lending very large sums of money to the Spanish king and to the Dutch prince, William of Orange, were both allies in a very prolonged war against France. And the Spanish king was actually unable to repay this debt. So, as a reward for his services, he actually ennobled Lopez Suazo. So Lopez Suazo was one of the few Jews, and those Jews were typically Sephardic Jews, who gained noble status in 17th century Europe. So I'll show you here. Oh, so this is really interesting. So I want to show you. So 20 years after he settled in Amsterdam, the Portuguese merchant community actually built a synagogue for the Sephardic Jews that was called the Esnoga. And here you can see a painting representing the synagogue. And I think the reason it's significant, it shows you first the wealth of the community that they were able to build such a place of worship. Second, it shows you how integrated Jews were. That first they had not only a right to open worship, but that they were able to build a space that was so large and visible. And third, it shows you that Jews were part of the landscape of the city in 17th century Amsterdam. So talking about the right of property, actually several Portuguese Jewish merchants owned very large mansions in the city. So this is the house of the Belmonte family. And here you can see a house that belonged to David de Pinto. So here you can really see how flourishing the community was. And of course, not everyone, like those were exceptions, but they kind of speak to this idea that some Jews, even before emancipation, were able to access really a very wide array of civic rights, not political rights. And this is an important qualification. Okay, so here I want to show you the Lopez and Suazo coat of arms, because as part of getting ennobled, the family got a coat of arms. And this is something that they were very proud of. And until the modern era, descendants of the Lopez Suazo actually would display this coat of arms on tombstones, on dishes, even on talits. I found among those Western Sephardic families prayer shawls that bear the coat of arms, right? And what's really interesting is that when the coat of arms was registered by the Spanish authorities, the registrar who officially inscribed the coat of arms into the Spanish registers spoke about the lineage of the family, about the fact that they were descendants from a long line of Iberian hidalgos. And he also wrote, in their day, so the forebears of the Lopez Suazo family, served their kings both on land and on sea against the Moors, against Muslims, and enemies of our holy faith and the Spanish crown, right? And what's so interesting is that this coat of arms was given to the family at a time when they were openly Jewish, and it was a known fact. But you can see through this particular document how they straddled their identities as Portuguese merchants based in Amsterdam and people who really came from a very Catholic Iberian milieu. So really people with multiple identities. And this is the reason that a lot of us historians have referred to Sephardic Jews across Europe as being cosmopolitan, because they really straddled those different worlds. Another source that I think is exceedingly fascinating, sorry, let me go back to the Lopez Suazos. So this was Antonio's son, Francisco, who actually performed similar services to his dad, because he also lent William of Orange considerable sums of money that enabled William of Orange to invade England and assume the throne in England. So you can see how those merchant families, how their fates were tied to the political history of Europe. And next to this painting of Francisco, there's a painting of his children. So you can see how they not only were part of the European elite, but presented themselves as, the educated, prominent elite. Okay, so that's one story. Now I want to move towards Hamburg to quite a different story. And Hamburg is interesting because in both Amsterdam and Hamburg, They were both Sephardic communities of Iberian Jews, conversos who had returned to Judaism, to Jewish practice, and Ashkenazim, right? So those two cities and really have this parallel trajectories. And as you will see with Glico, the legal situation of Ashkenazi Jews in the 17th century was rather different. So for those who are not familiar, I really encourage you to look at Glico's memoir. It's one of the few texts by a Jewish woman that we have for the 17th century. She was a woman to 14 children, if I'm not mistaken. I have 3, and I'm already overwhelmed. She had 14, so that alone is humbling. But she was also a businesswoman. She was involved in trade, and she was a widow. And when her husband passed, she took on the family business. And in her memoirs, she talks about traveling across Europe and conducting the family business. So extraordinary story. And on top of this, she found time to write about it, right? And it's an invaluable source for historians or anyone interested in Jewish history, and particularly anyone interested in the trajectories of Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, because she was an Ashkenazi woman, but because she was involved in trade and because she lived in places where there were also Sephardic Jews, she interacted with Sephardic communities a lot, and she had a lot of observation about this community as well. So I think this is very useful for understanding how these communities overlapped and how they face crossed in early modern Europe. So what I want to do next is look at her childhood reminiscences, what she writes about her childhood. And I apologize that there's a bit of text, but I think it's worth getting into it. And she describes what it was like, what the status of Jews was like when she was a young child. And she shows what the process of negotiating rights looked like for an Ashkenazi community in early modern Europe. So here's what she wrote in her memoirs. I was born in Hamburg, which was an independent city, a port city, which was very flourishing in the 17th century. So I was born in Hamburg, but I was not yet 3 years old when all the Jews of Hamburg were served with an edict of expulsion and forced them to move to Altona, which belonged to His Majesty, the King of Denmark, who granted the Jews good privileges. So here what I want to highlight is the question of privilege. What it meant for Jews before they became fully emancipated. What it meant for Jews to have rights is that they needed to negotiate privileges with the rulers. And often the rulers were, not only emperors, but also rulers of cities, right? And this process of gaining privileges entailed negotiating with the rulers for a certain set of rights. And often the set of rights were limited in time and they were bound to expire. So what's really significant here is that she described how the community was expelled from Hamburg. They lost the privilege of being there. And so they moved nearby. I believe that Altona is 15 kilometers away from, perhaps even less, from Hamburg. But while geographically close, Altona was under a different jurisdiction. It was under the jurisdiction of the King of Denmark. And the King of Denmark was much more favorably inclined towards this community, and therefore gave them what she describes as good privileges. Altona was barely 15 minutes away from Hamburg. There were some families living in Altona, about 25 households, and we had our synagogue and cemetery there. And here, do not take this for granted. Having a synagogue and cemetery speaks to a freedom of worship that was not, that Jews did not have everywhere. So it speaks already to the level of toleration, I would say, that they benefited from in Hamburg, that they could have a synagogue and a cemetery. We lived in Altona for some time until appeals to the authorities in Hamburg were successful, and the Jews of Altona were granted travel passes allowing them to enter the city and engage in commerce there. So here the problem is that the freedom of residence is tied to freedom of occupation, right? Those were traders who had previously lived in a place that had flourishing trade, and now they had to move somewhere else. But their commercial base was still in Hamburg. So even though they could not officially live there, they still needed to find a way to travel from Altona to Hamburg so that they could actually work. And so they had to negotiate that right. Each pass that allowed them to go back to Altona from Altona to Hamburg was valid for 4 weeks, right? So it had to be renewed on a monthly basis. The pass was granted by the mayor of Hamburg and cost 1 ducat. When the pass expired, a new one had to be obtained. However, the 4 weeks often turned into 8 for those acquainted with the mayor or other officials. So what do we see here? First, you have to pay for rights. Rights are not given, right? And rights could be expensive. And you had to renew them. So that means that you needed someone from within the community who negotiated this. And so that means that they knew the people who were making the decisions. And of course, that also shaped the Jewish community from the inside. Because who's going to negotiate with the mayor of Hamburg? It's not the poor, ordinary member of the Jewish community. It's the prominent members of the community, right? So that created social hierarchies within the community because that gave the people who were negotiating those rights leverage, social leverage, economic leverage on the rest of the community. So on the one hand, they were helping their community, but that also created tensions from within. And what you see here is that there's the fact that the 4 weeks turned into 8 is you can see that the rights were negotiated differently depending on who was actually pursuing the negotiations, right? So what I found remarkable in her account is that Glico, who came from a prominent family, she understood the social dynamics of this process of negotiating rights. So she writes, this made it very hard on people, poor things, since they had no choice but to go to the city all the time to earn their living. It was especially hard on the poor people. Many often dared enter the city surreptitiously without a pass. If the officials caught them, they were arrested, and their release was achieved only with great difficulty and large sums of money. So you can see again the financial transactions involved in gaining those rights. But I think what you also see, which I think is an important topic when you talk about rights and citizenship, is the issue of individual and collective agency. Because it's really significant that she writes that some people didn't even bother. So even though they were not allowed into the city without having those passes, they still went, right? They exercised their own agency at a cost, of course, but they did it nonetheless. Okay, so she said, sorry, I have to move. We remain there first. Matt, sorry, do you mind reading the first sentence because I can't see it on my screen the way my computer set up? Sorry.
Sure. We remained there for some time until my father, of blessed memory, interceded with the authorities, becoming the first Jew to return to live in Hamburg.
Gradually, following further intercession with the authorities, more Jewish families were permitted to live in the city. Whereupon, nearly all the households moved to Hamburg except for those who were living in Altona before the expulsion and stayed there. So here you can see again the role of the intercessor in gaining those rights. And eventually the Jews were able to return to Hamburg and did. So here you can see that the restrictions on residents really impacted people's lives greatly and forced them to move potentially several times in the course of one's lifetime. At that time, taxes paid to the authorities were very low. Okay, so then I'm not going to read all of it, but what she describes is how the community was able to return to Hamburg, but they didn't have a right to open worship. So they had no synagogue, they had no cemetery. So they lived in Hamburg and they worked in Hamburg, but they could not practice freely in Hamburg. And so that actually forced them to do the reverse journey, to go from Hamburg to Altona, where they could pray in a synagogue there. And then what she describes, which is again reminiscent of what she was saying about Jews going into the city without passes, is that Jews in Hamburg started praying in Hamburg in private spaces, unbeknownst, I mean, perhaps beknownst to the community, but against the will of the community, right? So the reason I think this source is so enlightening is that it shows you how every single right had to be negotiated and how temporary it was. So much time, effort, and money was spent to gain rights, however temporary. And I think this really shows you this process. So what makes legal emancipation different from, say, the early modern period is that it's a move from privileges that have to be negotiated to rights that are given on the basis that human beings have natural rights and that rights should be granted on a universal basis. And so this will bring me to the French Revolution in a minute. But I want to finish by showing you this painting of a court Jew. So a court Jew was a figure across European courts, typically Ashkenazi, but there is a version of this model in the Sephardic world as well, of people who rendered services to the kings, lent them money, supplied their armies, etc., who played a role in the court that gave them wealth and also gave them access to the political rulers and allowed them to lobby on behalf of their communities. And here it touches on what the very renowned historian of Jewish history, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, calls vertical alliances, right? The idea that you have this alliance from, bottom to top, where you have this few elite people who are who have direct access to the rulers negotiating on behalf of the community. So what that meant is that protection for Jews was given in exchange for economic or other services. The problem with that model is not only that those rights could be short-lived, but that it was exceedingly precarious because first, the ruler could change his mind, or the ruler could die and the next ruler could be very ill-inclined towards Jewish communities, right? So you can really see the precarity of rights in this model. So that brings me to really the event that a lot of modern Jewish historians see as the beginning of modern Jewish history and the beginning of Jewish citizenship, which is the granting of civic and political rights to Jews in revolutionary France. So we're talking here about the 1790s. And what I want to show you is that here again, the question of the differences in socioeconomic status between Sephardic and Ashkenazi and the ways in which socioeconomic status tied to the question of rights also played out quite significantly in the French context. And this is a story that historians know, but people don't necessarily know. And it really speaks to the ambiguity of the French Revolution and the granting of citizenship. So my third figure, and last for today, is Serf Ber, who was born in 1726 and died 1793, 2 years after Jews in France were given full emancipation. So Serf Ber was born in what is today a part of Germany, and he settled in Bischheim, which was close to the city of Strasbourg in eastern France. And at the time, when he was a young man, Jews were actually not allowed to live in Strasbourg. And this goes back to what I was showing you with Glickle of Hamel, that a lot of cities were off limit to Jewish communities. So though they could not live in Strasbourg, they conducted trade and other activities in Strasbourg, but they lived in the city of Bischheim. So it had quite a large community. Serf Ber became one of those figures that I described earlier. Not quite, well, I think I don't know if we would describe him as a court Jew, but it's a similar economic niche that he occupied. So he became a major financier, and he played a really important role in that he helped supply horses and fodder to the French army during the 7 Years' War. So here again, you see Jewish wealth playing a very active role in waging the wars of European rulers. And that made him quite wealthy, of course, but that also gave him rights that were pretty much unprecedented in the Ashkenazi community of Eastern France at the time. So, through a very complicated process, he was actually able to live in Strasbourg at a time when, again, Jews were not allowed to live there. And after like long-standing wrangling with the magistrates in the city. But even though he was able to live there eventually, he didn't have the right of to own property. So he actually borrowed a name, a Christian name, so that he could secretly purchase a house that would house his family and where he could conduct his business. And so from his Strasbourg based, he was able to expand his family business, not only in banking, but also trade, cloth production, etc. What is really important about Cerf is that he used his role as financier to the French king to really defend the rights of his fellow Jews, especially the Ashkenazi community in France. So one thing that he fought against in particular was the Leibzoll, which was the body tax, which was that not only could Jews in Alsace not live in Strasbourg, but every time they entered the city to conduct business, they had to pay a tax, similar to a tax that was taken on cattle. So it was a very discriminatory policy that, of course, was very humiliating, not only for Cerfberg, but for the community at large. So he proposed to lease the tax collection rights from the city. So he paid this huge sum of money so that the poor peddlers from Alsace did not have to pay themselves. And thanks to his advocacy, the city actually abolished this tax in 1784. And this is significant because this is before the French Revolution, a few years before the French Revolution. But the city demanded a huge sum of money in exchange for abolishing the tax. And this is, of course, Cerfberg was the one who paid that sum of money. So you can see here how the granting of rights was extremely limited and really piecemeal, and how it occurred at great effort, thanks to people like Cerfberg, who was already part of a pretty small minority of people. You know, his case was exceptional in that most people did not have the wealth and political connections that he had. Another thing that's really significant, and this brings me closer to the French Revolution, is that among his efforts to improve conditions for the Jews in Alsace, he contacted the German Jewish philosopher, Moses Mendelssohn, for support. And here it really speaks to kind of the transnational story of emancipation. If we look at Jewish rights in France only in the context of France, we're missing a lot of the story. So Mendelssohn convinced Christian Wilhelm von Daum, which was this very important writer, German Christian writer, to write an essay advocating for giving civil rights to European Jews, right? And during the French Revolution, Cerfberg became involved in the process of negotiating with the French National Assembly the right of citizenship for Alsatian Jewry. So we have a few minutes, so now I want to get into the actual process of what happened during the revolution. So first, I think mapping it is helpful. You really have to understand that before the French Revolution, there was no such a thing as the French Jewish community. Rather, there were Jewish communities that were quite distinct from each other, economically, legally, culturally. The Comtat Venaissin was papal territory, so it did not belong to France, so I'm not going to look at it. The two communities that are relevant here are Alsace-Lorraine, from which Cerfberg was from, which had the bulk of the Jewish community, 30,000 Jews, were all Ashkenazi Jews, many poor people, right? Peddlers, small merchants, Yiddish speaking. They did not know French for the most part. Cerfberg knew French, I'm sure, as did other among the elite, but the vast majority of people were impoverished Yiddish-speaking Jews, right? Because the territory of Alsace was actually acquired from Germany in the 17th century, so a relatively new acquisition for the French state. So very different context from the Jews of Bordeaux and Bayonne in southwestern France, who spoke French, were quite acculturated, as I described earlier. They had come in the 16th century, acquired a number of rights, and really culturally were very French already, even before they were considered French citizens, right? So very different legal status. So here you can see actually two representations that show you this. This is a depiction from the 17th century of a Jew in Lorraine, so in the eastern part of France. And it said on the engraving, "I am a Jew and I have wealth that I acquired through cunning and cleverness." Right. So the idea of the cunning Jew was involved in usury, which of course people were because of the restrictions on occupational freedom, or the lack of occupational freedom. And this association of, Jews and greed was still exceedingly prevalent on the eve of the French Revolution. And in fact, there were great economic tensions between Ashkenazi Jews and and their Christian neighbors in Eastern France. So by contrast here, you see an example of a very prominent Sephardic woman who was born in Portugal, but the Rabat family moved to southern France around the time of the Lopez Suazo family, actually. And the Rabat family became very involved it's the story that I've told you already, right, in global commerce. And they had this huge property in Bordeaux. So you can see through those two figures the gap between the two communities. We're going to skip this. Okay. So in 1799, the French revolutionaries, the French National Assembly, adopted a document that many of you are probably familiar with, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Men, which was very influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment, right? The idea that we're in the age of reason, the idea that, again, as I said, people have rights and that the state can create a new society by creating a shared citizenship that really abolishes corporate status and brings people together, based on the principles of freedom and equality, kind of those very noble ideas. So I'll read you this particular article from the Declaration. The law is the expression of the general will. All the citizens have the right of contributing personally or through their representatives to its formation. It must be the same for all, either that it protects or that it punishes. All the citizens, being equal in their eyes, are equally admissible to all public dignities, places, and employments, according to their capacity and without distinction other than that of their virtues and their talents. Okay, this is an absolutely gorgeous document, animated by very lofty ideals. But the question is, okay, but who is a citizen, right? And that was really the crux of the matter, that the National Assembly had to decide who fit within this category of citizen. And so that raised many questions about different categories of peoples. And in fact, the Jews were not the first on the list to be discussed, not at all. They discussed the Protestants, they discussed certain professions. Are actors citizen? Because actors were seen as, on the margins of society. Are executioners citizens, right? So in the course of 3 days in December of 1789, when the National Assembly discussed who could be citizen, the question of the status of Jews came up. And it was very heated. And actually, after those 3 days, the National Assembly was not able to finalize their decision on this. So they left the legal communities in limbo, right? They didn't make the call then that Jews in France were citizens. So that triggered a process of very significant advocacy by Jews themselves. So Jews in Paris, both Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews already lived in Paris at the time, sent delegates to the National Assembly. The Jews of Bordeaux and Bayonne sent delegates, and the Ashkenazi Jews sent delegates, right? To advocate it, not for the rights of all Jews, but to advocate for the rights of their own community. And what's interesting is that those different delegates originally met in Paris, but they actually could not agree amongst themselves about what to advocate for. And so that meant that they made the decision to kind of each go their own way. So there were different petitions that were sent to the National Assembly by these different communities. And what is so interesting is that the petitions looked radically different. So I know it's 9:02. Matt, rest assured that we're nearing the end. Okay, there will be time for questions and answer. Okay. By the way, feel free to start posing questions in the chat that I will happily answer later. Okay, so the two petitions, among many actually, there were many more, but the two that I think really encapsulate how these two communities thought of themselves in this particular context are the first one is by the Jews of Bordeaux to the French National Assembly. I'm not going to read all of you, but all of it, but I'm going to show you the significant portions. So the argument that the Jews of Bordeaux made is we are already citizens. Why would we not be recognized as citizens when we already benefit from all this array of civil rights? And so what they did in the petition is just listing all the rights that they had gained and that showed that they were useful members of French society. So they said that, we've been established in Bordeaux for a long time. We've lived here peacefully for a long time. We have lived in perfect security. We're confident in our status as Frenchmen. So they're arguing that they're already Frenchmen and that it would be a violation of the rights defended by the revolutionaries to actually deprive them of these rights. So they say, we're actually quite worried. And they said, we believe our status in France would not even be questioned today if not for certain petitions presented by the Jews of Alsace, Lorraine, and the Trois-Évêchés, so the Jews in eastern France, which seem to have created confusion that now affects us. So what they're saying is, do not lump us together with these Eastern Jews, okay? They don't have rights, perhaps, but we do, and we, if not for them, we would not even have petitioned you because we know that we're already citizens. So then they say next, we do not know what their petitions contain, but according to public reports, they must appear quite extraordinary since those Jews seem to aspire to live in France under a separate regime, with laws of their own, and to constitute a distinct class of citizens apart from all the rest. If this is true, that Ashkenazi Jews in France are asking for communal autonomy, so if what they're asking for is to retain the ability to divorce according to Jewish law or to go to the Beit Din, to go to the rabbinical court, etc. If this is true, we think that such a demand comes from misguided religious zeal, and we trust that once reconsidered, they will recognize, so Ashkenazi Jews will recognize more clearly the worth and advantage of the honorable rights attached to the quality of being citizens. We sincerely desire this for their own sake. So this, it's such strong language, right? You see very clearly here the attempt to distance themselves from Ashkenazi Jews and saying, one, we're already Frenchmen, right? This is non-negotiable. Second, these Jews, and in fact, Ashkenazi Jews, they came from, in France at the time, came from a much more traditional milieu. And they were rightfully worried about losing their communal autonomy and what that would mean for their religious practices. And so indeed, Ashkenazi Jews wanted to retain some degree of communal autonomy. So what the Jews of Bordeaux and Bayonne said here is, this is not what we're asking for. If you think this is what we're asking for, you are gravely mistaken. We're asking for you to preserve our existing rights. We're not asking for anything else. And we're certainly not asking for anything that would keep us separate from other people in France. So here, I'm not going to read it, but you can see that they actually listed all their rights. So they said, we've been benefiting from the royal lettres patentes since the 16th century. We own property. We have the right to buy and sell estate. We don't have special laws. We participate in the bourgeoisie, in the local bourgeoisie. So we contribute actively to the political life of the city. We pay taxes. We have made loans to the city, et cetera, et cetera. And then they end the petition by asking, could any be more respectable than that of having participated in the very formation of the August Assembly that is now irrevocably to determine our fate. Because some of the prominent members of this community were involved in voting for members of the National Assembly, right? So really making the case that we are French. Moving on to Ashkenazi leaders. They could not make that argument because, of course, their rights did not come close to the rights that Sephardi Jews had been benefiting from. So their petition is of a total different register because what they argued is we need to be made citizens because of the ideals that you are promoting. This is a complete rupture with history. This is their revolutionary moments where you get to decide who gets to belong on a completely new basis, the basis of universal rights. So this petition, I'm going to show you just a few sentences, but it was 107-page long, right? So in the course of 100 pages, they really sketched out all the reasons why, due to like the principles that the revolutionaries were espousing, they should be made citizens. And the one I think that is quite significant is the idea that rights should be independent from religious principles. They say, well, indeed, this is a Catholic country. You know, Jews represented 0 point something percent of France, a tiny community. So we know it's a Christian country, but civil rights are entirely independent from religious principles. And all men, of whichever religion they might be, being all equally able to serve the country, defend her interest, and contribute to her splendor, they should all equally have the title and rights of citizens. Thus, so then he kind of summarized the argument, and they say it is in their power, so the power of the revolutionaries, this moment to break their irons, right? Seize the moment. Now, what's really interesting is not only that the petitions were quite distinct, but that they actually were two moments of Jewish emancipation in France. And I think this really shows you the ambiguity of the French Revolution. So the National Assembly recognized the rights of Ashkenazi Jews in January 28 of 1790, right? So not only did they extend the civil rights that they had already acquired, but they also gave them full political citizenship, right? But they did not settle the status of Ashkenazi Jews for over a year and a half. So you have a situation where Sephardic Jews are emancipated, they are citizens, but Ashkenazi Jews aren't. So it's only in September 27 of 1791 that the Ashkenazi Jews were emancipated. And really the context for this was concern for the integrity of the Constitution. There was concern that if they were not going to be recognized as full citizens, then it would void the Constitution in some ways. So actually, in 1791, Ashkenazi Jews gained full rights of citizenship alongside free blacks and mulattoes in France. And so here also there's an interesting story, I don't have time to get into it, of the rights of blacks in France and the blacks of Jews and the ways in which they also intersect in quite interesting ways. Okay, this brings me to my almost final slide, which takes you 57 years later. So we're now in 1848 France, right? Mid-19th century. And though, as I said, the revolution contained many ambiguities surrounding Jewish citizenship and rights, it was nonetheless a very important rupture. And I think what really encapsulates this for me is like the status of French Jews half a century later. And you can see this here on the slides through two particular figures. The first one is Adolphe Crémieux on the right side, who was Jewish and was elected Minister of Justice twice, once in 1848 and the second time in 1870. And we will return to that moment because Adolphe Crémieux was actually largely responsible for the collective naturalization of Jews in Algeria in 1870, right? So there's an imperial story there too that we will discuss in a few sessions, right? So a French minister of justice, right, could serve burr Serberg, who died in 1793, have imagined that 50 years later, a Jewish man would be elected twice, would be picked twice as a minister of justice, right? The other figure is also a remarkable figure. It was an actress who was known actually for being an amazing tragedian, who was named Rachel Felix, and who became an icon of France in 1848. She had a remarkable voice, and she rendered the Marseillaise, which is now the French national anthem, to great acclaim. So 1848 was, of course, another revolutionary moment in French history, and she became the face of Republican France. And what you see here is Rachel Felix, this really well-known actress, wearing the French flag, being draped in this white dress, singing the Marseillaise, right? Which is really the symbol of France to this day. And she was known as like both these individuals were very public figures. They were known for their Jewishness. And actually, Rachel's first name was Eliza, and she picked his middle name as her first name because she was proud of being Jewish. So she never hid this from anyone. And the reason I wanted to end with these two figures is they show you the ways in which Sephardic Jewry and Ashkenazi Jewry kind of were able to kind of merge in this revolutionary moment and beyond. Because Rachel Felix was the daughter of Ashkenazi peddlers from Switzerland. And Adolphe Crémieux was a Jew from a very, long-established family, Sephardic family in southern France. So by the 1900s, by the 1840s, as a result of this really momentous moment, those communities, there was no longer any distinction along the lines of what we described in this class. Matt, if you permit me for to show a final slide, I want to show you kind of the ongoing resonance of those ideals by showing you something that really struck me, which is that in 2024, Paris hosted the Olympic Games, and there was a number of cultural performances that really were meant to show the history of France, but also its future, and show what it means to belong, kind of the complex layers of belonging in France today. And one thing that really struck me, because it is so reminiscent of this, vision of Rachel Felix holding the French flag and singing the Marseillaise, is that one of the people who performed during the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games is a woman from Guadeloupe. So she is a French citizen from of Afro-Caribbean descent. And I just want to give you like 1 minute to listen to the performance, because in France there are many people of color, but they don't necessarily have a lot of political or cultural representation. And this ceremony really made me understand better what it would have meant for Rachel Felix to be the face of France in 1848. So this will be my final slide.
Dans quelques instants, le journal Laurent Delahousse, d'abord la Marseillaise.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here, but it's such a remarkable performance. And I'm just going to leave it by saying that the question of representation and rights is an ongoing saga for Jews and other communities, and we're all part of this saga.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And I know it's late for many of you, and one of the advantages to having several sessions with Professor Gudefin is that any questions we don't get to, or if you have their thoughts, we'll have other opportunities together over the next few weeks.
And
And
emails.
emails.
Please email me anytime.
Yeah. So if we miss any questions tonight, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be able to answer. To get us started, somebody asked, you mentioned that Jews like Surf Burr lived in areas where Jews were not allowed to live, but remained Jews by identity. How did they practice Judaism, practices such as part of Jewish life? What kinds of practices were possible without a Jewish community nearby?
That's a great community. So there was a great, so Surf Burr, before moving to Strasbourg, lived in Bischheim. And there was an active community. It's just that worship was often restricted to the private sphere. So in Alsace, I think there were only 2 synagogues, and those were synagogues that had been built before Alsace actually became French territory, right? So that means that Jews were actually, especially in Eastern France, quite observant, and they observed Jewish practice, but it was very much private, right? So no processions, no public worship, right? So it's not that they were prevented from observing Jewish law. It's just that they could not be visible publicly as Jews.
Thanks. And you had mentioned other minority groups and their connections. There's a couple of questions about that. If other groups had to negotiate their rights and or pay taxes that the majority didn't have to pay.
Okay, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is really Jews in Europe, like I'm not talking about like imperial expansion, but in continental Europe, were the other, right? So there were a lot of divisions within Christianity. Obviously, wars between Catholic and Protestants. Obviously, a lot of tensions within, like between Protestant sects themselves, right? So, yes, like in places that were overwhelmingly Catholic, the rights of Protestants were limited. I mean, France is the case in point, right? Throughout their history, Protestants in France faced great hardship and great restrictions to their rights. And before the legal emancipation of Jews, throughout the 18th century, increasingly Protestants were able to gain more rights. But actually, this is, as far as France is concerned, that is a great point. I think historically, French Protestants and French Jews very much felt like they have a shared history of discrimination. And if you look at post-revolutionary France, when both communities were, full citizens, both Jews and Protestants were at the forefront of secularizing French society, French education, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Because they understood very well what it is to be a minority group in a dominant Catholic country, right? So definitely other groups had to negotiate for their rights. But I think what makes the Jews unique is that across all of Europe, despite the variety of legal status, they were seen as the other, right? And this is quite a distinction from other places and other contexts. We're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire next week. Jews in Islamic lands faced restrictions, but nowhere close to what Jews in Europe, in Christian Europe, faced. It was quite a different legal situation, actually. And then as far as minority groups is concerned, it's interesting that some of the most vocal advocates for Jewish emancipation also defended the rights of free people of color. And that's the case, for instance, of Abbé Grégoire, who I didn't have time to discuss today, was a Catholic priest who became very involved in the 1780s in France in defending the rights of Jews. And he also spoke a lot about the rights of free Blacks and mulattoes. So there was a sense that these groups belong to the same category of people, in the sense that they've been on the margin. They have not been recognized as having of deserving rights, but they should actually gain those rights because we're in a new era, right? So you can see really here how the ideas from the age of Enlightenment shaped discussions not only over Jewish status, but also over other groups.
Thank you. And one person asked, what is it about the Dutch culture that they were willing to accept Jews as citizens earlier than other countries?
Okay, so this is an interesting one. I think it ties to like the history of religious diversity there. I'm not an expert on like Dutch history, so I couldn't tell you exactly what fostered this kind of toleration. But one thing that perhaps I didn't make clear enough in this lecture is that Jews in Bordeaux, Amsterdam, Hamburg were belong to a category that Jewish historians have called port Jews. So they lived in port and they contributed to commerce. So the reason these communities were welcomed were not just like, lofty ideas of toleration, but it's that they had skills that were valued by those port cities, right? And so, Amsterdam was a merchant city. I think the leadership was merchants. So they very much understood the economic value of this diaspora community. That was really the main impetus for bringing them in, not just, oh, we want to respect everyone's religion. And in all those places, they came as new Christians, right? As people who were formerly Christians. And then when the city recognized that they were actually quite useful to the city at large, they rights were recognized even after they reverted to Judaism.
Thank you. And what was the role of Napoleon in the process of Jewish emancipation?
Oh, that is a great question. Okay. Oh, great question. I actually had slides about Napoleon that I had to skip. So what's really interesting is we have this idea, French Revolution, emancipation, and Jews are no longer have corporate status, so they're only French citizens. Napoleon belies that theory because only 15 years after the French Revolution, he actually gathered an assembly of Jewish notables and he asked them 12 questions that were meant to assess whether Jews in France were indeed loyal citizens. And yeah, like I'm a historian of family life, so I find it really striking that the first three of those questions were about family life. It was, do Jews permit intermarry with Christians? Can Jews divorce? So there was divorce at the time, but it was very restricted in French law. And do Jews practice polygamy, right? So the idea that the place where you really show your allegiance to the nation is in the family, right? Your family custom speaks to your true kind of national belonging. So he asked them these questions, and then the following year, he actually gathered rabbis in what he called the Grand Sanhedrin, kind of linking this back to Jewish history, where he ratified the answers that were given to him by the rabbis, right? So it shows you that Jews as a collective did not disappear, number one. And second, that even 15 years after the revolution, there was lingering doubts as to whether they truly belonged. And in addition to this two gatherings, Napoleon enacted laws that were very damaging economically for the Jewish community. He canceled the debt. Like he pretty much targeted Ashkenazi Jewry as a group that was kind of a burden on the French economy, right? So again, after the French Revolution, you see that there's still ongoing tensions about Jewish status and belonging in France. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And as we come to a close, there's a few questions here, and I think some of them are more broad, maybe even better for different sessions. So we'll save them, or I'll share them with you after this program. But one here specific to one of the historical figures you mentioned. Did Suasso know or was influenced by Spinoza?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. yeah, I guess they overlapped. I forget when Spinoza died exactly, but I'm sure I mean, for sure he knew of Spinoza, but I don't know the story there.
All right, great. Is there, so just as anything you want to leave us with this evening as we approach the end?
I mean, I love that you mentioned Spinoza because I didn't mention him, but that's what a great example of yes, someone from that milieu that contributed really to like political theory and how we think about rights today. I would just encourage people to reach out to me if they have any questions. And I mentioned a few books earlier, so if you have any questions for resources, I'll send also the Posen Library website. But books that you think you might want to read, let me know, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this session and for joining us. And we really, really look forward to the next sessions coming up. So
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week.